You know, it's not often that you play a game that is as weird, wacky, and wonderful as what is coming up today. It's certainly the weirdest game that I have played on this channel so far, with the exception of one other game that I played many years ago when I did Let's Play content. Really, the game that I will be reviewing today is something of a comedic compilation of other games, something that you don't tend to see nowadays. You get compilation games quite often, in fact, with fighting games it's customary. But you don't tend to see games take a comedic spin on the games they take after. And when the Japanese give a jokey makeover to stuff that they've already made, you can be sure that it will look bizarre to Western eyes, but no less entertaining. Happy holidays, everybody. We're doing Parodius. This game is known by a fair few names. Its Japanese name, Parodius da神話からお笑いへ, its translation, Parodius from Myth to Laughter, its localized title, Parodius Nonsense Fantasy, or simply Parodius, is a shoot-'em-up developed and published by Konami. It initially released in the arcade in 1990 before releasing on the Nintendo Famicom and eventually Super Famicom. It also saw a European release on the SNES, with Europe also seeing the sequel to this game in the arcades. This game is actually a sequel to a game developed initially for the MSX computer called Parodius: The Octopus Saves the Earth. The MSX wasn't designed to handle smooth scrolling, so it looks noticeably stuttery, but generally speaking it worked well as a transplant of the Gradius and TwinBee styles of shoot-'em-up. Likewise, this Parodius is a side-scrolling shoot-'em-up which takes its gameplay cues from games like the aforementioned Gradius and TwinBee, but turning up the absurdity to the maximum in its uniquely Japanese ways. I don't really have much to add right here, so I think it's best that we get moving onto what is in this game. And we shall start, as we always do, with the packaging. Our copy of Parodius here is a little bit battered, but still good enough for us to have a look at the cover and see a fair few details. And it would be fair to say that things look a little bit chaotic here, to put it rather mildly, given how many characters are here, but at least a somewhat sensible logo is placed at the bottom. I do quite like this cover though, for the simple reason that it's reasonably representative of the game itself, and the insanity within. I think the octopus here best represents this cover in a way, in that it's pants on head ridiculous. On the back we have an absolute weirdness. I almost don't want to translate any of this frankly, partly because of how weirdly everything is laid out here, but mainly because a lot of the text reads in a particularly weird fashion that's difficult for me and my foreign mind to understand. I assume this is based on a newspaper or something? At least that's what I think it is, based on the frayed looking top part of the back. There's also the curious case of this image having scan lines, so they most likely just photographed a television set rather than hand drew the image or used pixels for it. That said, it does feel like it sells the weirdness to me even more. I'm weirded out by this game purely by looking at it and knowing it exists. I'm starting to feel like a H.P. Lovecraft protagonist, minus the racism. Inside the box is a plastic tray which holds our cartridge and a manual. Let's have a look at the cartridge PCB first, and we will discover that much like panelled upon, it uses just a ROM chip, a lockout chip, a capacitor, and 2 resistors. It's not a particularly heavy game and it doesn't include a battery to save onto, but being relatively early in the console's lifespan, its production cost would likely not have been as reduced as it would have been with panelled upon, for example. As it is though, we have a mostly vacant cartridge, but with the content that this game has, that's not really much of a concern, as we will see in time to come. For now though, let's check out the manual. It's relatively standard stuff. It covers the story, menus, gameplay screen, power-ups and enemies in reasonable detail, all of which account for the majority of the game, all things considered. A fair chunk of this manual is dedicated to some colourful, amusing illustrations which only further the idea that this game is nutty. But even some of the text manages that from the couple scraps that I managed to translate and figure out. The good thing with this being essentially an arcade port, however, is that the simplicity of the gameplay is such that you won't really need the manual for it, although it doesn't hurt to have it if you want a better understanding of each of the different items available to you. So for the final time this year, let's plug it in and play this thing. The game starts up with the classic Konami logo that we loved and adored, before rather immediately throwing us into a menu with a few options on it, consisting of a 1-player mode, 2-player mode, options, and an extra mode. I'll go over the options in a little bit when it's more appropriate, but right now, let's start up the game by selecting 1-player mode, picking one of the 4 playable characters, and being greeted with a rather jaunty soundtrack. Taking control of your particular character, you can move in the 8 cardinal and ordinal directions with the D-pad, and by default the B button will fire your weapons. You can also hold the B button down to continually fire your weapons, which is useful for most situations involving a lot of enemies, as we will see. The core gameplay of this game is quite simple, and the loop is quite straightforward. You progress through an introduction to the upcoming level, and face patterns of enemies in a sizable level, before encountering a mini-boss of sorts and lastly encountering the level boss. It's a fairly simple gameplay loop that arcade games like this have played with in the past. As it happens, we played a game that's like this some months back, with Omega Boost. It plays in much the same in that regard, but it controls wildly differently naturally. Now before I continue, I'm going to explain something that will probably be my downfall, but I think it bears acknowledging that I am really not good at side-scrolling shooters. It's not a genre of game that I am used to playing at all. I own very few of these kinds of games, with a couple others that I own being Area 88 and Ikaruga. So suffice it to say, I'm not in the best position to talk about side-scrolling shooters with any kind of authority. It also means you'll be seeing me die a lot, be it because of something stupid or because I'm stupid, although the two are not necessarily mutually exclusive. In other words, you'll be seeing something like this happen somewhat regularly. With that being said, Parodius does at least have a few things to it that enable people like me to be able to play this game, but I'll go over those when the time is appropriate. So let's talk about some gameplay stuff and how this works. Like most games of its ilk, one major part of it is its use of power-ups. The power-up system works in much the same way that it does in Gradius, in that you effectively get tokens to spend on a list of different items. Destroying certain enemies may show one of the 3 different pickups: an orange one, a blue one, or a bell. We'll go over the blue ones and the bells a little bit later, but for now the orange ones are your tokens. The power-up bar at the bottom of the screen will tick to the next item for each one you pick up, and pressing Y selects that power-up, immediately giving your ship an upgrade in performance. The game also affords you the option of your character being automatically powered up, meaning that although you still have the ability to press Y and manually upgrade, you won't necessarily have to do so. The blue pickup is quite a lot simpler in that it serves as a bomb that destroys all non-boss enemies in your vicinity. It's such a useful tool that it pays to make use of it in an especially efficient and clever way. Essentially, when you see that power up, it's best practice to save it for when the screen gets flooded by Gribblies, so that you can maximise its usefulness and destroy everyone that gets in the way. It's a very useful thing, especially when you use it well. The other remaining pickup is a bell. Much like the bells from TwinBee, you can pick it up to score points, but it's not just a way to score points there and then. In fact, it's a surprisingly complicated pickup. Shooting it forces it to bounce away from you, and it has a chance of changing colours. And depending on its colour when you pick it up, you'll get a reward of some description, ranging from bonus points, to a death wall that kills enemies, to a bomb that you can deploy on command, to becoming substantially bigger, to being given a megaphone. Yes, a megaphone. You can attack people with sentences that come from the megaphone for a few seconds. Did I mention this game was Japanese? So supposedly there's a story to this game, but being real here, who actually cares? Well, since there is one, I may as well make mention of it at the very least. Essentially, our octopus boy called Taco tried to become a travelling entertainer, but he became sworn enemies with a creature called Bug, who destroyed all the hopes and dreams of the people Taco helped. Several times did he try to defeat Bug, but to no avail as he was too quick. As a result, he enlisted the help of his old pals Vic Viper, TwinBee and Pentaro to defeat him once and for all and restore humanity's desire to dream and aspire. So yeah, there's your background. The story itself, we just bumble from level to level, destroying the many enemies we encounter, and taking in the sights and sounds of what might be one of the most surreal games I've ever played, with the possible exception of LSD Dream Emulator. Seeing as how I mentioned the sights and sounds of this game, it makes sense for me to talk about the game's audio-visual components, since there's only so much I can talk about where the story is concerned. So let's start off with the graphics for this game. The game's visual style is wonderful, featuring a lot of silly enemy designs ranging from a pirate ship that's also a cat, to a showgirl that no doubt gives giantess fetishists something to think about, and even the regular old Moai enemies that look like a group of tourists. There's a lot in this game's art style. As simple as it looks from the outset, there's a lot of little details dotted about the place. There's no way I can unpack them all because I'm at odds with my own visual acuity when it comes to details, but suffice it to say, this game has got a lot going on. Quite apart from the art style, of course, there's also a discussion to be had in terms of how well the game handles all these graphics. To put it simply, there's a lot of sprites on screen at a time under normal gameplay, which, considering it's a shoot 'em up, shouldn't really come as too much of a surprise. In a weird way, there's something impressive about the Super Famicom's ability to just crunch all of these sprites and throw them onto the screen with little to no issue whatsoever, although I did encounter some amount of slowdown using the bell bomb, as I'm going to refer to it. I suppose even the Super Famicom has its limits when it comes to handling sprites. Still, it's quite impressive that it managed to handle all that chaos in the first place. Then again, I suppose it's a good thing that the Super Famicom doesn't really suffer from sensory overload. Running at the usual 60 frames per second, it's certainly technically solid, as one would hope for a game of this kind, despite the hitches encountered when using a screen clearing bomb that you pick up from a bell. As for the game's audio, allow me to introduce you to the Konami Kukeiha Club. Konami have something of an in-house group of video game music composers and sound designers. Named for the square waves used in 8-bit chiptune music, you can guess from the outset what their wheelhouse is. The music in this game doesn't generally consist of original compositions, or at least not in standard gameplay for the most part. Instead, much of the actual composition is taken from classical composers such as Tchaikovsky, Beethoven, and Strauss. Rather than using classical works redone for 16-bit consoles, however, they reworked them to sound even more chaotic and comedic, resulting in some of the more unusual yet entertaining music that the Super Famicom has ever brought to some speakers. If there's anything you can take away from this soundtrack, it's that Konami Kukeiha Club know a thing or two about taking established works and reworking them in such a way that it might take a second for the actual composition to sink in due to how well it was worked. A lot of amusing triumphant sounds, a catchy style all to itself, and just the right amount of bombast make this quite the entertaining soundtrack. I would certainly recommend listening to a couple of the tracks if you were interested. Even the general sound design pops in this game. With the bombastic soundtrack in the background, you might expect the sound effects to fall by the wayside, but that's not the case here, as the game manages to give enough volume to the sound effects themselves. The quality of the sound as well is pretty good, and although you'll hear the sounds of your ship firing off a dazzling array of shots throughout your time playing, it's never annoying or harsh, so it allows for concentration. Parodius' presentation is pretty great for an early Super Famicom game. It's one of those instances where, as fervently gameplay first as I am, I'm willing to give the presentation some amount of airtime because it's one of the things that shines the best in this game. So having established this game has style, does it really have substance? What is there to the gameplay, and is it worth playing as a challenge, more than just being a feast for the senses? Well, let's discuss how the game handles accessibility first. I realise accessibility is a bit of a dirty word to some when it comes to video games, because some people get bottom bamboozled over the idea that people want to play video games and have a decent time playing them, but here we are. Basically, this game is surprisingly playable even for people who don't usually play shoot-em-ups like me. It accomplishes this with a few simple things, but the key thing in particular is that you have, effectively, infinite continues. This way, even people like me who have neither the inclination or, really, the ability to learn the intricacies of the game, can jump in and spend an hour or so playing the game and progress reasonably far, possibly even beat the game. You do still have the problem of having lives, and your score goes bye-bye if you lose your lives, but that's not exactly a bad concession to have. If anything, that just pushes some players to want to perfect their Parodius play. Other ways this game makes things more accessible is by having a difficulty select of sorts. It's not a simple easy, normal, hard thing, but rather a scale with 7 options, affecting opponent projectile speed above anything else. It's the easiest way for the game to really do anything about the difficulty, simply because of the linear nature of the game, and it's about being able to navigate your way around these enemies. You can also increase the number of lives if you want your high score to stay a little longer. I also love how this game's manual predated id Software's humorous descriptors for difficulty options, with how some of these descriptions are written. It's so adorably backhanded, whilst also feeling an amount of sarcastic concern for players who decide to go a little further than the game generally considers advisable. Don't let these options fool you about how tricky this game can be, however. Although not as brutal as, say, Gradius, Parodius is still quite tricky. I can never really get far without running into trouble, and trying to pay attention to everything that's going on at a time is not my strong suit. And this is probably the part where I talk about the things I'm not so keen on. For a start, there's a lot going on at any one time, which is very much a double-edged sword. I honestly don't know how some people can manage to take all of what's going on into account at a time, because it's almost dizzying with how many shots are being fired at you. I'm also not a fan of the movement in a way. This game handles movement in much the same way Gradius does, and includes a feature that I'm not really keen on, namely crashing. If you hit a ceiling or a floor with your craft or character, that's a life gone immediately. I really don't like this, mainly because I'm not used to games that do that. I'm pretty certain Area 88 doesn't do this, or Ikaruga, but this is a feature here because it's weird really. This game features options to automatically activate power-ups and give you the option to slow bullets down, but it does nothing as far as hitting the floor and the ceiling? It's a bit obscene, to be blunt. To be honest, I can't think of much more to say with this game, so I think it might be best to cut to the end for now. There's only really so much I can think of with this game, owing to it being outside of my comfort zone, so let's wrap this little thing up now. For as far outside of my comfort zone as this game may have been, this is still a pretty enjoyable game. One that I want to return to at a later date and get better at, since it does have things in place to enable people like me to get into shoot-em-ups and do so more organically. I can't really review this game as a shoot-em-up, mainly because I don't play them often enough to know what to look for. I don't know what the conventions are, I don't know how they play, I don't know the strengths and weaknesses of each game, what makes one good, what makes another one bad. I can only really review this game on the strengths of what it does to me. And in that respect, it's done a lot. It's opened me up to a genre of games that I've generally avoided owing to seeing one too many videos of Danmaku shooters like Mushihime-sama and Touhou. This one, despite not being at all easy to play, is a lot more inviting, partly because of its more cartoonish tone, but also because of the accessibility options the game affords, which is pretty cool for a game from the 90s. But how accessible is it to Western audiences? Well, the game only got a localization in Europe and not North America, surprisingly. Parodius is not the easiest game to get a copy of as a result, and your decision will largely be based on whether you care about it running in 60Hz or 50Hz. If you want a Japanese copy of the game, you can expect a loose cartridge to set you around 2,000 yen, or a boxed copy to set you back around 4,000 yen. I paid £40, which is not too far off the latter, and all things considered, that's not bad, given the replay value proposition this game offers. As far as language requirements are concerned, it doesn't actually require you to understand Japanese to get the best enjoyment out of this. A lot of this game is in English, and outside of the odd joke spliced in here or there, like the Moai brothership, it doesn't ask you to know that much Japanese whatsoever. Saying that, shoot-em-ups don't generally require you to understand Japanese much to play them if they're the Japanese version, simply because the gameplay tends to be pretty self-explanatory. Granted, saying anything in this game is self-explanatory is like pointing to half of the internet at this point and going, yeah, the joke writes itself. With that said, it's actually quite easy to get to grips with this, and although you may miss out on a joke or two, it isn't an absolute requirement to enjoy the game. So, all in all, I would say that I recommend this game. It's replayable, funny, full of character, and has some unique set pieces that make it all the more entertaining. Despite the occasional gripe that I had with this game, however, I can honestly say that it has been no less fun to play in the end. If you're yet to dip your toes into the shoot 'em up genre and want something to try out, I would recommend this in a heartbeat. Where did Parodius go from here? Well, as alluded to, this series had quite a bit of airtime in the 90s, with several of the games releasing in the arcades and consoles. The first to follow on from this would be Gokujo Parodius, which released in 1994. It released in Europe as Fantastic Journey, and even saw a compilation release on the PlayStation and Sega Saturn, along with the original game in Gokujo Parodius Deluxe Pack. The next game would be Jikyo Oshaberi Parodius, it releasing in 1995 for the Super Famicom, and a year later on PS1 and Saturn. As the name suggests, this features a lot of voice samples, spruced in rather frequently, telling the player what's going on at any moment. The game following this one would be Sexy Parodius, and as the game's name implies, it's a little bit spicier than the others in terms of its content. Not necessarily to a point where YouTube would just throw a fit if I were to show a video of it, but it's closer to the NSFW side of things than most. There is one other game in the series, but rather than being a shoot 'em up, it's, of all things, a turn-based strategy game. Paro Wars is unusual by the series standards, so much so that I can barely find any footage of this game that doesn't already have people talking over it, or is just the opening. After that, the majority of what came after were smaller games and pachinko stuff. Parodius had had its time in the sun, and Konami went on to other ventures, but then it was decided that in 2008, Konami would develop their own new shoot 'em up. Automedius, releasing in 2007 in the arcades before receiving ports to the Xbox 360, is another take on the Gradius style of shoot 'em up, but featuring anime girls in, shall we say, particularly revealing attire. In fact, there are certain features with these ports. And I think it's time to wrap this up. Parodius is a brilliantly entertaining romp. It's a fun game to play, and even though I suck eggs with the shoot 'em up genre in general, it's one of those shoot 'em ups that I can actively get along with, without feeling entirely overwhelmed with everything. And with that, that's all for this review, and indeed for this year. I'll be doing a follow-up video on New Year's Day, going over what happened this year and how it's gone for me. It's been a brutal year, but in some regards, I'm content. If you have any ideas of what I should cover in the future, please let me know in the comments down below, and my VG Collect list and Twitter profile are linked in the description down below. As ever, however, this has been Daniel Learmouth. Sidee.